Hi and welcome to this first video of my knitting series for beginners. In this video we will talk about yarn and knitting needles and how to use those two together, what to use, when to use, how to use. And what you will learn today is how to combine yarns with different knitting needles and what to think about when you pick your yarn and your knitting needles. But also you will learn what yarns to use for different kinds of projects. If you make mittens or if you make a sweater or if you're making a hat or whatever you might be making. So there are a few things to think about when you are planning to make a new project. So let's get started. And with me in this video I have a skein of Drops Nepal, which you might recognize from my last video, which you can check out up here somewhere. And I'm going to show you a special thing about these little yarn labels that are surrounding the yarn. So what you can see here is that they have a lot of information on the yarn. For example, you see what needle size is recommended for the yarn, what length it has, what content it has, how much it weighs. And that's important because you want to know how much yarn you get in one skein of yarn, but you also want to know what needle size is recommended for the yarn. So for example, this yarn is recommended 5mm needles, and which is equivalent to US 8/H8. I'm not really familiar with the US needles, but it also has another very important key factor in the label. It says gauge, which is a very important thing when you talk about knitting. So what is gauge, you might wonder? Well, gauge is actually how many stitches you get in this direction and in this direction. With me I have a few examples on gauge swatches, as they are called in English, or provlapp in Swedish. So what you do is that you knit your gauge swatch together with the yarn you're using, whether that's 1 strand, 2 strands or 3 strands or whatever, and then you count the stitches in both directions. So you count how many stitches you get on 10 centimeters, like a square of 10 centimeters. So for example, in this case I have also added a little note here. You can see, but it says 23 times 31 on 3mm needles, which means that I get 23 stitches in this direction and 31 stitches in this direction. So what that helps me with is to tell me how many stitches I need in order to get 10 centimeters on this direction and this direction. And that's very important, especially when you make your own project, but also when you make any project, because you want to know that you get the right tension. So for example, if you're making a sweater with the intended gauge of, let's say, 17 stitches and you get 20 stitches, then you might have a problem with the fitting of the sweater, because if you have too many stitches in comparison with the pattern, then you will get a much smaller sweater. Because if you think about it, if you have too many stitches in comparison to how many stitches you need in the pattern, that means that you will have a much smaller sweater than if you would have the correct gauge. It means that you have to make more stitches in order to get 1 centimeter than you would have if you had the correct gauge. And the same is of course for the opposite way. So if, for example, you would need 20 stitches for your project in this direction and you get 17, then it will be too big instead. So it's very important that you have your gauge correct. And I could illustrate this with 2 examples, the 2 swatches I have here. So the first swatch is a much thicker yarn together with a mohair yarn. So it makes this very beautiful hairy fabric that you can see. If you would have a yarn this thick, or I actually have 2 different yarns, and you would have the same gauge as this little piece here, then you would obviously, since this is a much thinner yarn, you would get a much bigger fabric because you get less stitches per centimeter on this little gauge swatch than you would in this one. So this one gets a lot more than the thicker fabric. I hope you get what I mean by this. We don't always have to rely on the labels of these skeins. You can actually do as you wish with the gauge that you get. Because, for example, if I am a very tight knitter, that means that maybe I get much more stitches on a gauge swatch with this yarn than I would do if I were to look at the label here, which recommends me 5mm needles. Maybe I need to have 5.5mm needles or even 6mm needles in order to get the correct gauge, which is on this yarn 17 stitches times 22 rows. And especially that's the case if you use a mohair yarn, which I was talking about before. That would potentially decrease the amount of stitches that you get on a row of 10 centimeters, because the thicker the yarn, the less stitches you get on your row. But the mohair yarn is mostly because you want to have this hairy effect on the finished fabric, so you don't necessarily have to change your needles, but I would make sure that you make a gauge swatch together with the two yarns if you want to have a perfect gauge for your project. So what about if you want to make a sweater for the summer or a sweater for the winter? Well, you don't necessarily want to have the same content of the yarn when you're making those two kinds of project, because in the summer you want to have a light sweater which is maybe a bit more airy than in the winter. You want to keep the warmth in the winter and you want it to be a bit airy in the summer. So for example, if you're making a sweater for the winter, these two, as I showed you before, might be the perfect combo for that sweater. But if you're making a sweater for the summer, maybe a cotton yarn would be much better for you to use. But there are also, of course, a few exceptions. For example, there are yarns which are a percentage of merino and a percentage of cotton, which is, for example, very common in shawls when you make those. So it all depends on what kind of project you're making. But you can, of course, use a wool yarn, but it will probably be very warm to use in the summer. That's also the case the other way around. So when you're making a sweater for the winter, you might not want to have a cotton yarn. Even though you could use it, it's not going to be as warm as if you were to make it in wool or a mix of wool and mohair or whatever you prefer to use, maybe alpaca. So I would totally recommend that you use a wool yarn of some sort, whether it's alpaca or regular wool or merino wool, to make your winter sweater. And actually that applies to any kind of winter project, whether it be mittens or sweaters or hats. And I wouldn't make a hat in cotton, for example. Many hats that you buy in the stores are made of cotton, but I would definitely make sure to use a wool yarn or alpaca yarn when you make a hat. And you might wonder what kind of knitting needles there are, and there are actually quite a few, but there are mainly three kinds of knitting needles that you need to know about. The first one is circular knitting needles, and they could be either interchangeable like these ones are, or they could be like one unit. So with these, you just pick the millimeter number that you want to use for your project, and then you add a cable to these two. So these stick out on each end. And if you don't want to have these interchangeable needles, which not everyone has, then you can use these instead, which are not interchangeable, but they are stock as they are. And there's really no difference between them except for that they are interchangeable. So these look like this, and they are very nice to use. Especially I like these metal ones, and there are those who like wooden needles when you knit in the round, but I like metal. Makes this funny noise, which many think is very annoying, but I don't think so. I like the feel of these, but I would recommend actually wooden needles for you who are new to knitting, because this is a pair of needles who are very slippery, so this makes it very slippery because it's metal. So I would recommend you to try to use wooden needles before you try to use metal needles. But there are also another type of knitting needles. I have this to show you. These are also for knitting in the round, and I will say that the needles I showed you before is for knitting in the round, but you could also knit plain back and forth. But these are called double pointed needles, and also they are called DPNs. So if you hear DPNs, that's what they mean. And this is also for knitting in the round, as I said, and these are in, I think, bamboo or something, and they are very easy to use, but I would not recommend you to use these thinner ones because they easily break. So for example, these are very good if you are a beginner, as I said before, but they are also very good if you want to knit a gauge swatch, for example, if you just want a small project that fits on your needle. And you get a nice grip of these, and they are very nice to use. These thicker ones don't break as easily, of course. They are quite sturdy, actually. But I would be careful about using the thinner ones. And these you use in a combination of 5 because you are knitting in the round. You are are using it as a, this will be hard to show you. You are knitting it in a square, not very beautiful square, but you are knitting it like this. So you have stitches on each of these needles, and then you use the fifth one to knit with the one that you are holding. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think you maybe have seen it before if you have been watching a few videos of knitting. I don't use them that much for that purpose, but instead I use these circular needles for that purpose. There's a technique called magic loop if your cable is too long. I will not get into that in this video. Maybe that actually suits for a more advanced series if you would like that. Tell me in the comments if you want it. And these needles are actually very similar to the needles that you might have seen before on, you know, traditional knitting, where you just have one stick there, and then you knit. I don't use them that often because I have DPNs if I want to have a small project, but otherwise I just use my circular needles for most things. So if I were to summarize this video, I would say that the most important thing is that you check your yarn label to see what gauge you need to get in order to have a nice fabric, and what needle size you need to use to get that gauge. And the second one is to use a yarn that is suitable for your project. So if you're making a sweater for the winter, you might not use a cotton yarn or linen yarn, but instead you would use a alpaca yarn or a wool yarn that is a bit warmer to use. And the third one is to actually make a gauge swatch, because you will probably regret not doing it. If you are making a project and you're having a wrong gauge, then you will be very disappointed if it's too loose of a fit or if it's too narrow and tight on your body. But when you're beginning with knitting, I would suggest that you just buy a regular acrylic yarn, because it doesn't really matter if you're trying out the method of knitting, if you are having a wool yarn, a premium yarn of some kind, or if it's a cotton yarn. Just try the most basic yarn, the cheapest yarn that you can find. And it's the same with the knitting needles. I would just make sure to get the correct needle size for the yarn that you're using. So look at the label of the yarn, and then you buy the needles that you need to have for that specific yarn. And when you have been knitting for a while and trying out different methods, and in the videos that I will post later on, then I would go for a maybe a bit more expensive yarn, a wool yarn of some kind that is not too expensive. Because remember, if this is not your thing, then you shouldn't be spending too much money on it. But if you think it's fun, then go for it. Buy a better yarn, try out new techniques, and advance in your knitting. And that's what I think is so fun about knitting. You can always advance and learn new stuff and make your projects even better, because there are always ways to improve your knitting technique, your style of knitting, the aesthetics of the knitting, and the practical use, of course. So with all of that being said, I hope that you have been appreciating this video, that you have learned something, and I'll see you in the next one when we are going to talk about how to actually cast on and knit. So see you, bye.